A quiet diner, a teenage girl in an oversized, battered leather jacket. Then the deafening roar of 20 Harleys. The Hells Angels walked in, looking for trouble. They laughed at her. They mocked her, until they saw the patch on her back and the entire room went dead silent. The Mave Desert in mid-July is an unforgiving expanse of cracked earth and shimmering heat waves. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun beats down with a heavy, oppressive malice, baking the asphalt of Interstate 15 until it looks like black liquid. Nestled just off the highway, a few miles outside the barren stretches of Barstow, California, sat the Rusty Spoke, a diner that had seen better days decades ago. Its neon sign had long ceased to buzz, the letters bleached pale by the relentless sun. Inside, the air conditioning rattled violently, fighting a losing battle against the 110-degree heat. Sitting in the furthest corner booth facing the entrance was 17-year-old Chloe Jenkins. She looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of cracked red vinyl and faded, checkered linoleum. Chloe was slight, her frame thin and exhausted, her blonde hair tied back in a messy, sweat-dampened knot. She nursed a mug of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. But it wasn't her youth or her exhaustion that drew the occasional, lingering glances from the diner's few patrons. It was her jacket. Despite the sweltering heat radiating against the diner's plate glass windows, Chloe was swallowed whole by a massive, heavily distressed black leather jacket. It was easily 3 sizes too big for her. The sleeves hung past her knuckles, the broad shoulders slumping down her narrow frame, and the heavy cowhide looked as though it had been dragged behind a truck through gravel. It was deeply creased, smelling faintly of old motor oil, stale tobacco, and dried rain. To anyone else, it looked like a ridiculous sartorial choice for a teenage girl in the dead of summer, a thrift store mistake, or a desperate attempt at an edgy aesthetic. But to Chloe, it was the heaviest thing she owned. It was her armor. She pulled the lapels tighter around her chest, staring blankly at the sugar packets on the table. She was 300 miles from home, running on 4 hours of sleep and $32 in her pocket. She just needed a place to rest, a sanctuary for a fleeting hour before she got back on the Greyhound bus heading north. The quiet murmur of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of the ceiling fans, and the sizzling of bacon on the flat-top grill was abruptly shattered. It started as a low, guttural vibration that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath the foundation. The coffee in Chloe's mug trembled, tiny ripples forming on the dark surface. Within seconds, the vibration exploded into a deafening, thunderous roar. It was the unmistakable mechanical symphony of heavy V-twin engines. Not just 1 or 2, but a whole pack. Outside the dusty windows, the glare of the sun was broken by a parade of gleaming chrome and matte black metal. Over 20 Harley-Davidson motorcycles pulled into the gravel parking lot, kicking up a massive cloud of yellow dust. They parked in a tightly synchronized diagonal liner-pack formation that spoke of deep discipline and territorial dominance. Brenda, the diner's veteran waitress who had been wiping down the counter, froze. Her rag hovered in midair. The 2 truck drivers sitting at the counter immediately stopped talking, their eyes darting to the door. Even the fry cook peered nervously through the order window. The heavy glass door swung open with a violent chime of the bell above it. The Hells Angels had arrived. They poured into the diner like a sudden storm, immediately dominating the small space with their sheer physical presence. They were massive men, clad in heavy denim and scuffed leather, their boots thudding against the linoleum. Their cuts, the leather vests worn over their shirts, bore the infamous winged death head logo. The bold red letters on white backgrounds arched across their backs, proclaiming their affiliation and their territory. California. The air in the diner instantly shifted. The casual, lazy afternoon atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. The Hells Angels were not a weekend riding club. They were an institution, a brotherhood that commanded absolute respect and instilled genuine fear. They laughed loudly, their voices booming off the low ceiling, pushing tables together and throwing their heavy helmets onto the vinyl seats. Leading the pack was a man known to law enforcement and locals alike as a deacon. He was the president of the local charter, a towering figure standing 6'4" with a thick, iron-gray beard and arms covered in faded prison ink. His eyes were pale, assessing, and entirely unforgiving. Flanking him were his enforcers, Tommy Gallagher, a wiry man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, and a colossal, barrel-chested biker everyone called Grizzly. Brenda immediately rushed over, her hand shaking slightly as she pulled out her order pad, pasting on a tight, terrified smile. "What can I get you boys today?" she asked, her voice an octave higher than usual. Chloe pressed her back firmly against the vinyl of her booth, trying to make herself invisible. She slowly slid her hands into the oversized pockets of her heavy leather jacket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew she needed to leave. The Greyhound station was only a mile away. If she could just slip out the front door while they were ordering, she'd be fine. But as she shifted her weight to slide out of the booth, the heavy silver buckles of her jacket scraped loudly against the Formica table. In the sudden lull of conversation among the bikers, the sharp scratching sound echoed like a gunshot. Grizzly, who was sitting at the adjacent table, slowly turned his massive head, his dark eyes locked onto Chloe. He didn't look at her face. His gaze dropped immediately to the massive, battered leather jacket swallowing her small frame. A slow, mocking grin spread across Grizzly's face, parting his thick beard. He nudged Tommy Gallagher, pointing a thick, grease-stained finger toward the corner booth. "Well, will you look at this?" Grizzly rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly across the diner. "Looks like we got a real badass in the house, boys." The conversation among the Hells Angels died down, replaced by a collective turning of heads. Over a dozen pairs of hardened, intimidating eyes fixed onto the 17-year-old girl. Chloe froze, her boots planted awkwardly on the floor, half standing, half sitting. The diner was suddenly so quiet she could hear the humming of the neon beer sign in the window. "Hey, sweetheart," Tommy Gallagher called out, leaning back in his chair and crossing his heavy boots. "Ain't you a little young to be wearing a dead man's leather? We'll steal that out of your granddaddy's closet." A chorus of deep, rumbling laughter erupted from the bikers. "Careful, Tommy," another biker chimed in from the back. "She might be the new chapter president for the Girl Scouts. You see the size of that armor. She's ready for war." Chloe swallowed hard, her throat feeling like sandpaper. She kept her head down, her blonde hair falling forward to shield her face. "Just ignore them," she told herself. "Just walk out." She grabbed her small canvas backpack from the seat, slinging it over her shoulder. She gripped the oversized lapels of the jacket with trembling fingers, preparing to make the agonizing walk past their tables to the exit. Hold on, Grizzly said, standing up. His massive frame blocked out the light from the window. He took 2 heavy steps toward her booth, casually blocking her path to the aisle. "Where's the fire, little lady? We're just admiring your threads." "Please," Chloe managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I just want to leave." "I don't think you should," Grizzly chuckled, leaning his hands on the table next to hers. The smell of stale beer and exhaust fumes washed over her. "See, around here, leather means something. It ain't a fashion statement for little girls to play dress-up. That jacket you're swimming in, it's disrespectful. Makes a mockery of people who actually live the life." The tension in the diner escalated from uncomfortable to dangerous. The 2 truck drivers at the counter quietly dropped a $10 bill and slipped out the back door. Brenda, the waitress, took a hesitant step forward. "Now, Grizzly, she's just a kid," Brenda interjected weakly. "Let her go." Deacon, the president, who had been sitting quietly at the head of the pushed-together tables, slowly turned his head. He didn't say a word. He just leveled a cold, dead-eyed stare at Brenda. The waitress instantly snapped her mouth shut and retreated to the kitchen. Deacon stood up. The diner seemed to shrink around him. He walked slowly toward Chloe's booth, his heavy boots making a methodical thud, thud, thud against the linoleum. The other bikers parted for him instinctively. He stopped next to Grizzly, looking down at Chloe. "Take it off," Deacon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying, absolute authority. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Chloe looked up, her blue eyes wide with genuine terror, but her hands gripped the jacket even tighter. "No," she whispered. Tommy Gallagher let out a sharp whistle. Oh, she's got fangs. Deacon, I think you offended the lady. I ain't gonna ask twice, kid, Deacon said, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of amusement. You don't wear heavy leather like that in our territory, like it's a Halloween costume. It's an insult. Take the jacket off, leave it on the booth, and you can walk out of here without a problem. It's mine, Chloe said, her voice shaking, but a sudden desperate stubbornness flaring in her chest. I'm not taking it off, Grizzly scoffed, reaching out a massive hand to grab the lapel of the jacket. Look, you little brat, you're gonna... Don't touch me, Chloe yelled, a sudden burst of adrenaline shooting through her veins. She shoved Grizzly's hand away, the sudden movement surprising the massive biker. She scrambled out of the booth, but instead of stepping toward the aisle where Grizzly and Deacon stood, she backed up toward the wall, effectively trapping herself. She turned her body to squeeze past the edge of the table, desperately trying to find a gap to run. In doing so, she turned her back completely to the room. The oversized leather jacket shifted heavily on her shoulders. The front of the jacket was plain, worn, and scuffed. But the back was a different story entirely. As Chloe turned, the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner illuminated the center of the leather. There, stitched into the cracked black cowhide, was a massive three-piece patch. It wasn't a cheap knockoff. It was the real, undeniable, blood-earned colors of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. But that wasn't what made the air completely vanish from the room. Hells Angels patches were sacred. If a civilian was caught wearing one, they would be brutally stripped of it, the jacket confiscated or burned. But it was the specific patches, the rockers, and the custom stitching surrounding the death head that caught the light. Above the winged skull was the top rocker. Below it, the territory rocker. But right in the center, overlapping the skull, was an old, severely faded memorial ribbon. Beside it, stitched in heavy red thread, was a customized 1%er diamond pierced by a silver combat knife pin. And on the lower left flank of the jacket was a dark, jagged stain of blood that had soaked into the leather years ago, surrounding a perfectly round bullet hole that had been carefully stitched shut with heavy Kevlar thread. Tommy Gallagher's jaw literally dropped. The mocking grin on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of profound shock. Grizzly, who had his hand raised to grab her again, froze as if he had been struck by lightning. His eyes widened, knocking onto the bullet hole and the silver combat knife pin. Deacon, the hardened, terrifying president of the charter, took a sharp, audible intake of breath. He took one step back, his face going completely pale under his tan. He stared at the back of the jacket, his eyes tracing the faded letters of the memorial ribbon, reading the names stitched beneath the bloodstain. The deafening silence in the diner was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The mocking laughter of 20 hardened outlaws had been extinguished in a microsecond. Chloe, realizing she was trapped against the wall, squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the rough hands to grab her, waiting for them to rip the jacket from her shoulders. She braced for the violence she knew was coming, but the hands never came. Instead, a voice broke the silence. It was Deacon, but his tone had completely changed. The menace, the authority, the coldness, it was all gone. His voice was trembling, thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. Where? Deacon rasped, clearing his throat loudly. Where did you get that jacket? Where? Deacon rasped, clearing his throat loudly as if the words were caught on barbed wire. Where did you get that jacket? Chloe pressed herself harder against the wall, her breathing shallow and frantic. She didn't understand the sudden shift in the room. The predatory energy that had filled the diner just seconds ago had vanished, replaced by a suffocating, almost reverent stillness. It's mine, Chloe stammered, her voice cracking. My grandfather left it to me. He died 3 weeks ago. Deacon took a slow, heavy step forward. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he reached out a massive, calloused hand and gently, almost hesitantly, traced the faded letters of the memorial ribbon stitched above the death head. Arthur, Deacon read aloud, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Arthur Iron Artie Jenkins. Chloe's eyes widened. How do you know his name? Deacon didn't answer immediately. He stared at the Kevlar-stitched bullet hole and the dark rust-colored stain of old blood framing it. He slowly lowered his hand and took a step back. He looked at Grizzly, then at Tommy Gallagher. The color had drained from their faces as well. "Take your covers off," Deacon ordered, his voice echoing in the silent diner. In perfect unison, every single Hell's Angel in the room who was wearing a ball cap or a bandana reached up and removed it. The heavy, intimidating men bowed their heads slightly. It was a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. Chloe was utterly bewildered. Her hands loosened their death grip on the jacket's lapels. "Artie Jenkins was your grandfather?" Deacon asked, finally meeting Chloe's eyes. The cold, dead-eyed stare was gone, replaced by a look of profound sorrow and recognition. "Yes," Chloe whispered. "He raised me. After my mum passed, it was just me and him." Grizzly, the massive man who had mocked her just moments before, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He looked physically sick. "Deacon, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. Lots. All ons." "Shut up, Grizz," Deacon snapped, though there was no real malice in his voice, only exhaustion. He looked back at Chloe. "Little girl, do you have any idea what you're wearing?" Chloe shook her head slowly. It was his favorite. He wore it everywhere. When he got sick, he told me to keep it safe. He said it would protect me. A sad, hollow chuckle escaped Deacon's lips. He wasn't lying. That piece of leather is the best insurance policy on the West Coast. Deacon gestured to the booth. "Sit down, Chloe. Nobody's going to hurt you. Nobody is going to touch that cut." Hesitantly, Chloe slid back into the booth. Deacon slid into the seat opposite her, while Grizzly and Tommy stood guard at the edge of the table, their backs to her, forming a physical wall between her and the rest of the world. "Your grandfather was a legend," Deacon said, his voice low. "He rode with the original San Bernardino charter. He was riding out of Burdu back when Sonny Barger was organizing Oakland. Artie was a foundational pillar of this club. And that knife pin?" Deacon pointed a thick finger at the silver combat knife pierced through the 1% diamond. "You only get that pin for putting your life on the line to save a brother." Deacon leaned back, a heavy sigh rattling in his chest. "August 1998. We were running up the coast dealing with some friction from a rival outfit. We got ambushed outside a roadhouse in Bakersfield. A guy pulled a shotgun. He had me dead to rights, aimed right at my chest." Deacon paused, his pale eyes glossing over with the memory. "Artie stepped in front of me. Took the slug right in the back, lower left quadrant. That bullet hole right there. That was meant for me. He bled out on the asphalt while we waited for the medevac, but he survived. He saved my life, Chloe. I owe your grandfather my heartbeat." Chloe stared at Deacon, her mouth slightly open. She had known her grandfather was a biker, knew he had wild stories of the open road, but he had always been a quiet, gentle man to her. He baked her birthday cakes. He taught her how to change a tire. She had no idea he was a highly decorated, revered figure in the most notorious motorcycle club in the world. "I'm sorry," Tommy Gallagher said quietly from the aisle. He didn't turn around, but his voice was sincere. "I ran my mouth, kid. I disrespected Artie's blood. I apologize." "We all do," Grizzly added, his deep voice a low rumble. "So," Deacon said, leaning forward and resting his arms on the table, "why is Artie Jenkins' granddaughter sitting in a run-down diner in Barstow, swimming in his leather, looking like she hasn't slept in a week?" The kindness in his voice, the sudden, overwhelming feeling of being safe shattered the last of Chloe's defenses. The tears she had been fighting back for 3 days finally broke loose. She wiped her eyes furiously with the oversized sleeve of the leather jacket. "My grandfather died," Chloe sobbed quietly. "The house went to the bank. I didn't have anywhere to go, so the state put me with my step-uncle, Gary. He lives a few miles from here." Deacon's eyes narrowed. "And?" "He's bad," Chloe whispered, unable to look Deacon in the eye. "He drinks. He gets violent. Yesterday, he found out I had the jacket. He said it was gang trash. He tried to throw it in the burn barrel out back. I fought him for it. He hit me, locked me in my room, and said he was going to burn it today. A dangerous, suffocating silence fell over the diner. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I broke out through the window this morning, Chloe continued, her voice trembling. I took the jacket and whatever cash I could find. I'm trying to get to Fresno. I have an aunt there. I'm just waiting for the Greyhound. Deacon didn't say a word. He slowly turned his head to look at Grizzly. Grizzly's jaw was clenched so tight the muscles leaped beneath his thick beard. He cracked his knuckles, the sound like dry branches snapping. Gary, Grizzly muttered, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. Tommy, Deacon said quietly. Yeah, boss, Tommy replied, instantly at attention. Go outside. Tell the boys to cut the engines. We're going to be here a little while longer. Deacon turned back to Chloe, pulling a clean white handkerchief from his pocket and sliding it across the table. Dry your eyes, sweetheart. You're not taking the Greyhound, and you're not running anymore. For the next 30 minutes, Chloe experienced a surreal reality. She was no longer a runaway teenager hiding in a booth. She was royalty. Brenda, the waitress, brought her a fresh, hot plate of a cheeseburger and fries, refusing to take the crumbled dollar bills Chloe offered. It's taken care of, honey, Brenda smiled nervously, glancing at the bikers. The Hells Angels had transformed from an intimidating mob into a heavily armed security detail. 2 men stood by the diner's front door, their arms crossed. 3 others were outside pacing the perimeter of the gravel parking lot. Deacon sat with Chloe, quietly asking her about her grandfather, smiling faintly at the stories of Artie trying to bake cookies and setting off the smoke alarms. The peaceful interlude shattered when a battered, rust-eaten Ford F-150 tore into the diner's parking lot, kicking up a storm of dirt. It braked hard, skidding to a halt right next to Deacon's pristine, custom-built Harley-Davidson. Outside, one of the bikers immediately stepped forward, placing a hand on his belt. Inside the diner, the bell above the door violently chimed as a man stormed in. It was Gary. He was a thick, flushed man in a stained tank top, reeking of cheap beer and stale sweat. His eyes were wild with anger as he scanned the room. He spotted Chloe in the corner booth. There you are, you little bitch, Gary bellowed, completely ignoring the fact that the diner was filled with men in leather cuts. His rage blinded him to the room's atmosphere. I knew you'd come crawling to town. You stole $60 from my dresser. Get up, you're coming home right now, and that trash jacket is going in the incinerator. He took 3 heavy steps down the aisle toward Chloe. He didn't make it to a 4th. Grizzly stepped out from the adjacent booth, entirely blocking the aisle. The massive biker didn't say a word. He just stood there, a mountain of denim, leather, and muscle, his dark eyes locked onto Gary. Gary bumped into Grizzly's chest. It was like walking into a brick wall. He stumbled backward, blinking in confusion. Hey, move out of the way, biker. This is family business. Behind Gary, the heavy glass door of the diner clicked shut. Tommy Gallagher turned the deadbolt and casually leaned against the glass, crossing his arms. Suddenly, the reality of the situation crashed down on Gary. The alcohol-fueled rage evaporated, replaced by a cold, sobering terror. He looked around. 20 massive men had quietly stood up from their tables. They weren't yelling. They weren't posturing. They were just staring at him with a silent, calculated intent that was far more terrifying than any shouted threat. Deacon slowly slid out of the booth, stepping around Grizzly. He walked up to Gary, stopping mere inches from the man's face. Deacon was taller, wider, and radiated an aura of effortless violence. You must be Gary, Deacon said. His voice was soft, conversational, which only made it more horrifying. Gary swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He took a step back, but another biker bumped him forward. He was trapped. Look, man, she's my ward. I'm legally responsible for her. Not anymore, Deacon said simply. You can't just... Deacon moved with a speed that defied his size. His hand shot out, grabbing Gary by the throat and slamming him violently against the edge of an empty table. The wood groaned under the impact. Silverware clattered to the floor. Gary gagged, his hands frantically clawing at Deacon's iron grip, his feet kicking as Deacon lifted him an inch off the linoleum. "Listen to me very carefully, Gary," Deacon whispered, leaning in so close Gary could feel his breath. "That girl sitting right there is the granddaughter of Arthur Jenkins. She is Hell's Angel's blood, which means she belongs to us. If you ever breathe in her direction again, if you ever say her name, if you even think about her, I will come to your house. Grizzly will come to your house. And we will take you out into the Mojave, and you will never be seen again. Do you understand the words coming out of my mouth?" Gary, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, managed a frantic, wheezing nod. Deacon held him there for 3 more agonizing seconds before releasing his grip. Gary collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. "Get out," Deacon commanded. "And if your truck kicks up any gravel on my bike on your way out, you're dead before you hit the highway." Gary scrambled to his feet, terrified, pathetic, and humiliated. He didn't look at Chloe. He practically threw himself at the door. Tommy unlocked it, shoving Gary out into the blistering heat. Seconds later, the Ford F-150 slowly and carefully rolled out of the parking lot, vanishing down the interstate. The diner let out a collective breath. Deacon straightened his cut and walked back to Chloe's booth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of bills, mostly hundreds. He peeled off a heavy stack and dropped it on the table in front of her. "That's for a new start in Fresno," Deacon said, "courtesy of the California Charter." Chloe looked at the money, overwhelmed. I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Deacon smiled gently. "Artie paid his dues 10 times over. Consider it back pay." He reached out and tapped the leather sleeve of the jacket. "Keep wearing it, kid. Wear it proud. But you're not riding the dog across the state." Chloe wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "I'm not taking the Greyhound." "How no?" Tommy Gallagher laughed, walking over and tossing a spare matte black helmet onto the table. "You're riding with the president. We're taking you to Fresno." 10 minutes later, the Mojave Desert echoed with the deafening roar of 20 heavy V-twin engines firing to life. The heat waves shimmered off the asphalt as the pack pulled out of the Rusty Spokes parking lot, forming a tight, disciplined wedge. At the center of the formation, safe behind a wall of steel and muscle, rode Chloe Jenkins. She sat on the back of Deacon's custom Harley, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. The heavy, oversized leather jacket billowed slightly in the wind. The fading memorial patch, the silver combat knife pin, and the stitched bullet hole gleamed under the brutal California sun. She wasn't a runaway anymore. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, protected by the ghosts of her grandfather's past and guarded by the brotherhood he had bled for. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of brotherhood, respect, and unbelievable twists. Have you ever judged someone before knowing their true story? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your friends to remind them that sometimes the heaviest armor we wear is the legacy left behind by those who loved us. Ride safe. No.